If there was one person in the 1920s who was more known, idolized, and respected, it was Charles Lindbergh. He shot up from being a complete unknown to the most famous man in the world after a successful flight across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927, the first time anyone had flown from New York to Paris. It was considered the feat of the century. Born the son of a congressman in Detroit, Michigan, Charles Lindbergh grew up in a small town in Minnesota. As an adolescent, he was fascinated with machines and especially with aeroplanes. At the University of Wisconsin, he studied engineering, but he didn't have any plans of becoming an engineer. Much to the dismay of his parents, Charles decided to pursue a career in flying. Perhaps it was the romantic image of fighting aces in the First World War, or perhaps it was just the thrill of soaring through the sky freely, but Lindbergh knew what he wanted to do. First, Lindbergh went barnstorming in various parts of the country, performing stunts in the air. Then he enlisted in the Army at age 22 and completed flight training at the top of his class. He eventually became an airmail pilot, a coveted though dangerous job for young pilots. Although his job as an airmail pilot was about as good a job as he could have in his field, he started preparing for something a bit more ambitious. At the dawn of the decade, Raymond Orteig, a wealthy hotel owner, offered a prize of $25,000 for the first pilot or pilots to make a non-stop flight from New York City to Paris. 7 years later, the prize still unclaimed, Lindbergh aimed to do just that. Lindbergh was an unlikely figure to achieve such a momentous feat. At the time of his transatlantic flight, on paper, he stood no chance against the other competitors. His plane seemed almost second-rate when compared to his contemporaries, costing him only about $13,500, while others spent fortunes well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Lindbergh had struck a deal with a small, struggling aircraft company to build his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, preferring complete practicality and endurance over safety and luxury, unlike most of the other flying teams. Although it might have appeared second-rate, it was reliable. However, there was no forward visibility, which would make even landing a difficult task. Lindbergh also lacked an important quality that many of the other major competitors had. He had not flown during World War I. Being born in 1902, he was only 16 at the war's end and so did not participate. Other competitors, many being French, had almost all been flying aces during the war and were very experienced pilots. Of course, in this day and age, it's difficult to imagine how big a feat this really was. One of the most difficult aspects of his flight was that he did it alone. At that time, a majority of long-distance flyers had a second person on board who acted as the navigator. Navigating was difficult. Even with the second person to do the job, it was still very difficult to navigate accurately, which was made even more difficult the further you traveled. The navigator not only kept the plane on course, but was also tasked with keeping the pilot awake and giving him the food, water, or any other supplies he needed. Lindbergh did all of this by himself, and he managed to land in the precise area in France he had planned on, only getting lost for a short time. But when he had first taken off from Roosevelt Field in New York, there was little celebration. He seemed to just be a young, inexperienced pilot taking on an enormous task at an enormous risk, one of a number of ambitious young men. After a short delay from trying to find the exact airfield he had to land in, Lindbergh landed at Le Bourget Aerodrome at 10:22 p.m. on May 21, 1927. He was shocked to find so many people crowded at the airfield, and a little uneasy because his plane's brakes took a long time to stop the aircraft. Upon his successful landing in France, Lindbergh instantly became the most famous person in America and the world. In a time long before the internet, Lindbergh became internationally famous in just 33.5 hours. Very few people have shot up to such heights of popularity so quickly. Upon his return to America in June, he was swarmed by a massive crowd in Washington, D.C., numbering around 100,000 people. He was now a national hero. President Calvin Coolidge even awarded him the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Flying Cross, which were especially high honors considering that it was not a time of war. Lindbergh was not prepared for his sudden fame. He was uncomfortable with the swarming crowds and the pushy journalists. His privacy was gone. His every move and action was documented. He humored the attention at first, though didn't bask in it. However, as this invasion of privacy dragged on and on without end, he grew increasingly and understandably agitated. After his rocket to fame, he had endless engagements. Banquets, luncheons, ceremonies, and other public appearances plagued his life. The tight schedule made for him always failed to account for the long delays due to Lindbergh being cheered on by the crowd, struggling to make his way to where he needed to go. He often went a day or two without sleep, and the sleep he did get was all too short. He was also roped into agreeing to write his autobiography despite only being 25 years old. The completed book was hastily written to fit the agreement he had made. Under normal circumstances, it would have been considered a disappointing memoir, but because it was a time of Lindbergh fever, few were complaining, and the book sold extraordinarily well. But despite the negative effect his celebrity had on his personal life, Charles Lindbergh made an important contribution. His crossing of the Atlantic and his subsequent cross-country tour helped popularize airplanes again. After World War I, interest in airplanes had waned, and all the romance and excitement of flying aces had become irrelevant. But Lindbergh inspired a new generation of pilots who would go on to successfully complete more incredible feats. The love for Charles Lindbergh seemed to know no bounds. While many modern young people in the 1920s may have idolized eccentric figures like movie stars who lived the exciting, edgy lifestyle we might now picture, Charles Lindbergh offered a different kind of celebrity. Conservative, prim and proper, Lindbergh was a beacon of hope for many others, especially the conservative older generation. It took years for the obsession to calm down. Even on his honeymoon in 1929, he and his new wife were tracked down at sea by photographers and journalists. It must have seemed like he could never escape his own popularity. Even after the crazed phase of his popularity, Lindbergh continued to make big headlines once in a while. Although this is out of the limits of this channel, let's take a quick look at his life after the 1920s. Most famously, his son Charles Lindbergh Jr. was kidnapped on March 1, 1932 from the second story of the Lindbergh home while both parents were there. After an intense search, the boy's remains were found buried in a shallow grave not too far from where he was kidnapped. The trial was a sensation and ultimately resulted in the conviction and execution of one Bruno Hauptmann. He was reviled publicly, despite the evidence against him not being all that strong. In later decades, it was widely questioned whether he was really guilty. The trial had the unfortunate side effect of propelling Lindbergh once again into the public light after it had seemed like the worst of it was over. This must have been a nightmare after the obsession over him had only recently begun to calm down. Lindbergh made headlines again in the wake of World War II after he publicly supported non-intervention of the United States, which included not sending supplies to Allied nations such as France and Britain. Lindbergh had also expressed anti-Semitic thoughts since at least the late 1920s, and there were rumors that he had Nazi sympathies because of this, his commitment to non-intervention in Europe, and he and his wife's admiration of Hitler. And Lindbergh's continued support of eugenics after it had fallen out of favor, except in Nazi Germany, was a little concerning. During the war, despite being in his 40s, Lindbergh flew bombing missions in the Pacific. After the war, he lived a quieter life, far away from the vast crowds of overexcited fans of the late 1920s. He died in Hawaii on August 26, 1974. Despite his sometimes disturbing personal beliefs, Charles Lindbergh was the biggest and most respected celebrity of the whole Western world, at least for a time. He helped the struggling aeronautics industry recover in the post-World War I period simply through the inspiration of his feats of flying, and was an inspiration to many young, aspiring pilots everywhere. And he did it all with sincere modesty.
The kind of a son makes a mother feel proud. Lucky Lindy rides all alone in a little...
I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something about the great aviator Charles Lindbergh. If you want me to cover a certain person or event from the 1920s, please let me know in the comments below. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.